Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Kirsten Vacca, and I will be giving a mini lecture today on gender and sexuality in Hawaii. Ancestral Native Hawaiians, or Kanaka Maoli, had very different gender and sexuality constructs than the colonial binary many of us are familiar with today in areas that were colonized by the U.S. In this mini lecture, I will talk about the way gender and sexuality were constructed and performed in ancestral Hawaii from the mid-16th to early 19th centuries. I will also talk about how colonialism continues to impact the understanding of Hawaiian and Polynesian gender constructs, and how archaeology today can help to reclaim how gender and sexuality looked in the past. Throughout ancestral Polynesia, a three-gender system was common. In Hawaii, the three genders were wahine, kane, and mahu. While these gendered identities do not align with Western binary systems, and it is necessary to understand them within their own context, wahine is often translated as woman and kane as man. Mahu is frequently glossed as transgender, but this term is inappropriate for the ancestral Hawaiian context. Rather, Mahu were people said to embody both the wahine and kane spirit, representing a balance of the genders. Performance of gendered identities took many forms, but can be seen archaeologically through the tasks and roles that each person fulfilled within their communities, through the responsibilities. Wahine were said to be responsible for creating lasting material, highly prized items like kapa cloth and woven mats. They were also responsible for inshore fishing and gathering shellfish, and at times helping with farming. Kane were responsible for more ephemeral but life-sustaining work like food procurement and preparation, for deep-sea fishing, for farming, and they were also said to be responsible for wood carving. The roles for wahine and kane were about balance. Neither was considered more important or valued than the other. Mahu were people that physically and spiritually exhibited this balance of genders, what we would call in English both embodying the feminine and masculine. Mahu held an important place in ancestral Hawaiian culture as the keepers of wisdom and cultural traditions, and were responsible for passing on these traditions, in part through the teaching of hula. Gender was not only constructed through these daily actions, however, but was also associated with two important cultural ideals called mana and kapu. The relationships between kapu, meaning sacred, taboo, noa, which means free of kapu, and mana, played an essential role in defining the appropriate activities and social interactions between people in daily lives. Intimately connected to kapu and the sacred, mana was defined in a Hawaiian context as, quote, power originating from a spiritual source, end quote, according to Hawaiian scholar Noenoe Silva. The relationship between mana and kapu informed the social hierarchy in ancestral Hawaii, influencing everything from who had access to resources at what time of year and how these resources were dispersed, to how individuals of different gendered identities interacted with one another on a daily basis. The kapu system, among other regulations, designated separate houses within kauhale, or house complexes, for kane and wahine due to their different mana and their differing responsibilities within their communities. The separation was particularly important when preparing or eating food or engaging in ritual activities. The ai kapu was built upon this balance of mana, which was inherently relational, and the ai kapu means the eating taboo. Under this ai kapu, kane and wahine ate separately, with kane handling food preparation and cooking. Of interest to household archaeology studies are the material remains produced by these gendered tasks, from which we can better understand those relationships. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into how we know these things, into the mo'olelo, or oral histories that have been passed down generationally, that talk about the performance of gender within these household spaces. Many of these oral histories were recorded in writing in the 19th century by Hawaiian authors like Davida Malo and Samuel Kamakaua, or recorded from the stories that community members told in the 20th century by ethnohistorians like E.S.C. Handy and Mary Kavena Pukui, who offered a glimpse of these idealized organization of these kauhale in ancestral Hawaii. There were three intersecting social identities that become clear through these mo'olelo that impacted the daily life of households, which were specifically occupation, gender, and class. The connection between the physical design and use of the house space and gender is our window into these past gender performances through archaeology. Central to these mo'olelo descriptions of kauhale were the acceptable activities performed within each hale or house. Descriptions that specified who used each space within said houses are present in these mo'olelo. Many of the authors who recorded these histories also differentiated between ali'i, or chiefly or elite, and maka'ainana, or people who worked the land, when talking about house complexes. And they talked about how the ali'i class possessed much larger kauhale. Now I'll go into a description of what these mo'olelo say about kauhale. The primary houses, which were included in these accounts that were associated with gendered expression, were in part defined by the rules surrounding food. The hale noa was thus named because it was considered free of kapu. Here, everyone could meet, socialize, and sleep because no eating was allowed. Although some accounts talk about children breastfeeding here, no one else was said to be allowed to eat in this space. Once the children came of age, however, they were required to eat in their respective houses. Openness about anatomical differences can also be seen through the description of the hale noa. Sexuality and reproduction were an integral part of daily life in this space, with family members sleeping together. Sexual activities of legendary figures were included in the storytelling, chants, and hulas. And in addition, wahine and kane were free to choose multiple sexual partners, all of whom could have interacted freely in this space. The hale mua was the eating house for kane. Wahine were said to be forbidden from entering the house on pain of death. Here it was said that men and gods ate together. Once boys reached the age of 9, they were said to be pushed from the wahine eating house to the hale mua. The idealized ali'i kauhale was also said to incorporate a wahine eating house, called the hale aina. Here, wahine ate with children, according to some accounts. If male, the child moved to the hale mua for meals around the age of 9. Children ate with the mother, as she was considered the imbuer of cultural knowledge for at least a short while, and therefore the primary caretaker of children. Wahine did not prepare food in the hale aina. Kane cooked all the meals in earthen ovens. They instead ate and socialized in this house. Little is known of the hale aina beyond these purposes. Currently, the archaeological literature pulling from these commonly relied upon mo'olelo accounts mentioned here define this house by what is not present. For example, the food kapu to women, like pig or turtle and several types of bananas and potentially dog meat. The hale pe'a is the final structure I will discuss with regards to its importance in our understanding of gendered relationships. Wahine were required to enter into the hale pe'a during their menstrual cycle. During the time they were confined to the hale pe'a, wahine were barred from returning to the kauhale, and kane were barred from setting foot near this menstrual house. Other household wahine brought food to those in the hale pe'a, and to stave off boredom, days were spent weaving. Isolation in the hale pe'a did not revolve around the presence or absence of blood, however, but rather the completion of a ceremony at the end of one's stay there. The physical foundations of these different houses still exist on the landscape today in many places in Hawaii. However, what we see archaeologically shows a lot of variability in the design and organization of houses compared with these more idealized accounts from mo'olelo that I just discussed, which were recorded and translated into English in a later period. The material record evidences the many unique ways gender was understood and expressed across the landscape. The mo'olelo explicitly outlined what ali'i were supposed to include in their house designs, inferring that they followed the aikapu more closely, but they also recognized that maka'ainana did not build such elaborate kauhale. The archaeological record adds to this picture by evidencing how maka'ainana may have performed gender. Hawaiian scholarly Kala Kame'elehiva argued that, quote, it was the ali'i nui who had to follow the dictates of the aikapu most closely because they were the akua on earth who mediated between ordinary humans and the destructive reproductive forces of the unseen divinities of the cosmos, end quote. Kame'elehiva explains a foundational Kanaka epistemology of balance here, the understanding of human existence. A person could not be both akua and maka'ainana, or a deity and a field laborer. Balance of spirits and balance of roles was necessary to care for one another and the shared aina, or land. This balance is reflected on the built landscape and in the material record through the variability in the way people designed and used their spaces, each diverging from the stated ideal. We see this diversity in what the household would have looked like in ancestral Hawaii, depending on the intersection of gender and class status through the material record. For example, I look for how house spaces are designed and whether there is a separation of activities that is evidenced by the patterns of artifacts or assemblages across these spaces. Adherence to the aikapu is most closely evidenced by separate food spaces, for example, separate hearths or imu earthen ovens, and different foodstuffs within these spaces. What we do find is that houses associated with higher status individuals do in fact evidence that they were following the aikapu through the design of the house, but not always necessarily with separate physical structures. Some houses, for example, have double hearths within the same hale rather than two separate houses for eating. Smaller houses do not show the same type of separation of space, often only having one hearth and one oven. This type of design could be interpreted in many ways. For example, one-gender households or sharing of community hale for eating. Sexuality, remember, along with relationships in ancestral Hawaii, was far more fluid than what we understand today. It was possible for people to live alone, with family, with friends of the same gender, or in aikane relationships, which can be same-gender relationships, both friendships and sexual relationships. Kanaka maoli were not limited to one partner or one gender either. They could have multiple partners of different genders. These differences in the construction of kauhale across the landscape may also reflect what Kame'elehiva is expressing in her explanation of balance. Different kauhale designs evidence through the material record a diversity in gender and sexuality expressions and the importance of these intersecting identities of gender and class status. What you might notice here is that I have not talked much about the materiality associated with mahu. Archaeological literature and the mo'olelo most commonly relied upon by archaeologists rarely examines the role of mahu in the household, rather inferring or implying a normative nuclear family. Kehaulani Kauanui and Noenoe Silva, among other Hawaiian scholars writing about gender and sexuality in Hawaiian history, provide insight into why translations and interpretations of Kanaka maoli gender and sexuality in the past and present are often inferred to be binary and patriarchal. Kauanui states that 19th century colonialism in Hawaii elevated men's status by legally subordinating women and criminalizing gender identities and sexualities that fell outside of heteronormative European behaviors. This criminalization worked to shape practices that are today considered normative in academia and in Hawaiian daily life, but would have been foreign to early Hawaiians before their contact with the Western world. Silva argues that the translation of these oral traditions removed reference of the power of Hawaiian women in controlling of their own lives, instead reshaping the histories and narratives to conform to Western gender norms. And this can also be true of mahu as well. The colonial history of archaeology is reflected in the systems of oppression that are perpetuated through work that does not leave space for wahine and mahu stories. While the field of archaeology has made great strides towards decolonizing research practices, the underrepresentation of wahine and mahu in archaeological narratives signals the continued presence of colonial ideals that are perpetuated in the literature. Silva stated that feminist scholars have, quote, shown how valuable it is to notice the ways that women are kept out of colonial and post-colonial histories and how important it is to search out their contributions, end quote. This is equally true for the contributions of mahu. It is possible to see and talk about many of these contributions through the material record. As Hawaiian scholar Lisa Kahaleole Hall notes, colonialism takes sexualized and gendered forms that serve to stigmatize and disempower indigenous communities. Addressing gender and sexuality through ethical, community-engaged archaeology allows for increased visibility of the continued impacts of these colonial structures and can also be used as a tool in the emancipation of the oppressed, both past and present. For more information on Kanaka maoli gender constructs, I recommend watching the documentary Kumuhina that talks about the importance of mahu in the past and their experience in the present. as well as reading the book Gender on the Edge, which includes a chapter on contemporary perspectives from Mahu in Hawaii, navigating the continued colonization of Hawaiian gendered identity, and many other wonderful accounts, literature, material, and research written and produced by Kanaka Maoli. Mahalo nui for listening.